Thanks, Karen. So I'm going to be covering adjunctive therapies, and as Karen said, I'm one of the vets with CEVA. I have got an interest in behaviour, and I'll do a little plug for Edinburgh Uni at this point because I've done a couple of the modules on equitation science and equine behaviour and welfare and learnt absolutely huge amounts. I can fully recommend it to anybody. It was really useful. So the reason that CEVA have sponsored this is, a lot of the reason is because welfare is really at the core of the company. But also we do have Confidence EQ, which some of you hopefully will have heard of by now. But it's really just to let you know about that and to talk very briefly about pheromonotherapy. That's one word ticked off of the difficult ones to say. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about pheromones. Apologies, because some of you will, particularly if you're doing both dogs and cats as well, and will be very familiar with pheromones because of adaptyl and feliway, which we have. But it's just to kind of cover the bases of what pheromones are, how they work, and more specifically Confidence EQ. So the agenda is just going to be, what are pheromones? Pheromones in horses more specifically. The equine appeasing pheromone, which as you'll guess is what's in Confidence EQ. And then a little bit more about how you'd actually use it itself, so practically what it is. You've got a sample each in your bag, hopefully, so that's in there as well. So what are pheromones? Does anybody want to shout out something at this point, a bit of interaction? Definition? Nobody from CEVA, I can see you at the back itching there, Emma, to get in there. No? Anything about them?
Miracles, they're miracles.
Oh no, you see, that's what I'm here to do, is yes, it's a good point that no, we're not promoting that they're miracles, that's very much, listening this morning has been brilliant, and it's an adjunct, it's something to add into corrective behavioural therapy, and that's something that we learnt very much with adaptyl and feliway, is that as a responsible animal health company, what we want to do is make sure they're used properly alongside the correct advice. So thank you for that, Nat. So this is a definition, it's just one of the several different ones, but they're a natural chemical substance which is produced and released into the environment by an animal which affects its behaviour or physiology, of that individual, so it can be something back to itself, or it can be to leave a message to other animals of that species. But they're not ones that go between species. In the cat world, some of the big cats respond to feliway, some don't, which I find really interesting. So there are some links in terms of within similar groups, but it's back to themselves. So if you've got something on for dogs, your cat isn't going to be reacting and vice versa. It's a method of communication. And I think it's important not to forget that that's what fundamentally pheromones are there for, is to communicate. And it's quite, in terms of cost effectiveness, if you think of the energy involved, it's quite a low energy way of communicating to other members of the species. So it's quite useful in that way. And it's quite subtle as well, it's not overt. You're not having to parade around the field, or you're not having to display it as such. So it can be quite a subtle way of giving information across. They have a predictable effect on the behaviour. And it's important to know that pheromones are unconditional. It's not a learnt response. The pheromone binds to specific receptors, and that causes the same nervous response regardless of how often they've come in contact with that before. So we quite often get asked, particularly with the Confidence EQ, if it was an orphan foal, if it didn't come in contact, it's then not going to respond to it when it's an adult, and that's not true. There's of course a whole array of other things you need to consider about the behavioural sort of issues that foal may have because it wasn't with its mother, but in terms of responsiveness to a pheromone, it's not going to affect that. And it's detected by something called the vomeronasal organ, which the red bit doesn't work, but you can see the VNO's listed there. So that's a cross-section of a horse's head with a tooth and the hard palates of the roof of the mouth, and it sits just above that. And can anybody think of, I'll show you a picture in a minute, of what horses do to try and get more pheromone in? Yes, see, I knew someone would do a demonstration, so I didn't have to. It's brilliant. It's curling that lip back, so we've got some pictures there. So horses, luckily, when we talk about it in dogs and cats, we then have to try and demonstrate because people don't always believe us, but luckily with horses you don't have to do, particularly with the camera on, I don't have to try and do that because they're very obvious in what they do. But as I'm sure everybody here is aware, but when we talk to the public, they think of it as something that a stallion does, wheras certainly when my youngster was a foal, she used to do this. And interestingly, it will show a picture at the end, but anecdotally, about 50% of horses, when you put Confidence EQ on them, will display a Fleming response. My Exmoor doesn't, but my Creosia thoroughbred cross, my little polo pony, she does. Every time you put it on, she does a really nice Fleming response. But so the Exmoor never doesn't. at all in slight. It's just an individual thing. Doesn't mean it's not working, it's just individual differences. The phlegm response, it's not the same as smelling, so it's biologically different from that. And the pheromone binds to the chemoreceptors and it doesn't actually enter the cells. So there are lots of pheromones, and they, excuse my mouth getting dry, they convey lots of different types of information. So it can be to do with social rank, it can be to do with territory boundaries. We tend to think about cats with that I always found it really interesting that we mess up cats if we haven't got the lovely cat flats where they can come and go as they please, that they go out and they'll mark, that they have territories that often the same territory or cover different bits, and they'll go out and mark, and then we come back and let them out at a different time of the day because we've got a half day, and of course they go out and someone else is using the same patch. But when they leave the pheromone, not only is that to say I was here, but it also degrades over time, so the other cats can then also work out, well, that was about 2 hours ago. I don't know how specific it is because I'm not able to ask the cats, but they do seem to be able to gauge if it was very recent or if it was a few hours ago, which is useful for them. Recognition of other animals. It's partly, again, more on the sort of small animal side. When animals come back from being in a veterinary hospital, it's partly the smells and just them not being there, but particularly cats it can be very different when they come home. Formation of the maternal bond, alarm pheromones, and again we'll talk about that with the horses in terms of using this before they've had chance to release alarm pheromones. And cats with if any of you got cats, when you see them when they leave that sweaty bit on the vet table, when I was in practice I certainly saw that. There are alarm pheromones in the foot pads that they'll leave as well. So certainly I had days where you'd have really nice cats coming in later in the day that would for whatever reason be a little bit more worried, and it's because they'd left this marker on the table just to kind of say, this is not great, this is a stressful place today, so it's worth cleaning your tables properly. Sexual cycle, that's what, if you talk to people sort of randomly at the airport when they ask you what you do, they kind of go, oh, pheromones, that's all about sex, isn't it? And you go, oh, no, let's stop. It's not what I do for my life. But sexual cycle, particularly with horses when they're in estrus or in season, that can be one of the times when they're doing the phlegm responses to try and work out if it's the right time to breed. And then providing reassurance. So the equine appeasing pheromone, this is produced within a few hours of the foal being born, and the idea is that it makes them feel, or we believe it makes them feel more safe and offers them reassurance in the new environment, because it's important as a foal to want to go out and explore and interact when you've got the protection of mum near you, to learn that by playing and exposing yourself to things. And I always, Patrick Paget, I remember, who's at the Erster Institute where they developed the pheromones, I remember him talking about how they were trying to work out a way of proving it, but when you go through and you see, certainly if you're walking out in springtime and you go through a field and there's lots of sheep with the lambs there, and the lambs are away and they run back and then will sort of headbutt around sort of the mum's udder rather than actually necessarily feeding, or they'll take a smaller bat and they'll do a lot of headbutting. And he was saying he'd love to kind of show, because that's how they first looked at it, was wiping the area and using that to reassure animals, whether they're going back effectively for a little pheromone fix, that they're going back and sort of headbutting to get a little bit of a release of that. And they're also then protected because they're next to mum in case I was there with a dog or something and was a risk to them. So what is confidence EQ? It's a synthetic copy of the equine appeasing pheromone that mares produce as they nurse their foals, because I have been asked on occasion whether we've got a big yard somewhere of horses that we just take it from, but no, it's a synthetic copy. So just to get that clear, I didn't think I'd ever have to explain that, but I do now. And it's the ability for the horse to respond to the pheromone is something that I've already said that continues throughout its life. And in adult horses, it can signal that the environment is safe and secure, and so can therefore help with learning. And I always think, because I don't like spiders, I don't know if anyone else has got similar spider fear, a few nods. So if a spider sort of came up over here, in terms of me presenting to you now and how much I could learn, if someone said something really profound at the back and I thought, oh, that's amazing, I would half be listening and half watching that spider, or I might have left depending on the size of it. But it would certainly decrease my ability to learn because I'm distracted by the fear, I'm frightened. And that's taking, because to me, irrationally, that spider, to me is something I feel I need to be concerned about. So it's the same with horses, that if we can in any way help diminish that fear, it can help them learn. And I was just going to defer to, sorry, throw you at it, that Nat had used a bit of confidence with her young warm blood. I don't know if you want to make a...
Yes, there's a saga involving a horse called Puggle that Gemma actually helped me with, and Lisa's been, in fact, a few people in this room probably know Puggle. She's a New Zealand warm blood. She's now just coming 5. She's New Zealander, so she's back to front. And she's a lovely big horse, but she had a lot of fear problems, and I'd had her since she was born, but she'd spent I think she spent 7 months in New Zealand before she came over on a plane. So she hadn't had a particularly great start from that point of view, and she's from a long line of very sharp horses. So, you know, we had a horse that was naturally a little bit fearful, and then we went through backing, which was always a bit what we would call spooky. So Jo came to see us at vet school, left us some samples, which I snaffled and took home, and used the confidence EQ on her during moments, just when she was quiet before we started doing some handling or some early training. And I have to say, it is an N of 1, and I was very sceptical about putting this stuff up the nose, and I just thought, well, maybe I should just put Vicks up or something. But I have to be honest, I found the confidence EQ extremely helpful for that particular horse, and since have used it on a couple of people's horses who've also reported that they found it useful at times when the horse would normally have been a little bit tense.
So clinical data, I haven't got time to go into it. I'm just going to give you a very whistle-stop tour of what there is, and then if you would like it, please come and find me, and I will happily email to everybody if they want the abstracts and various bits. There is some data, and it's great that we've got that. We haven't got as much yet on the because Adapted and Feliway, we've got reams of papers. So if any of you are feeling inspired and would like to, then again contact us, because we're always keen to try and improve the evidence base that we've got, because it's really important that we feel we've got evidence behind the products. So there is some work on fear eliciting response, and on weaning and clipping and transport, and then on the learning side as well, and in the introduction of a new individual. So I'm just going to very quickly go through one of the abstracts that was presented, and that's the reason I've chosen this was partly because I really like it being there's lots of training indications and things, but I like the fact that there's the weaning bit in there as well, because I think it's something that it's a really great use for it, and also because it's clean data in the sense it was the University of Utrecht, not ourselves and not the Ursula Institute, so it's a bit easier for you guys. So there was 2 double-blinded placebo-controlled studies during this. One of them was evaluating sort of the dam and foal separation, short-term separation prior to weaning, and the other one was looking at adult horses during clipping. So I say this is very whistle-stop, so it's just a very quick overview. The dams and foals were separated. There was 32 pairs, and they were split into 4 groups. One group, the mare received it, one the foal did, one both did, and then there was a placebo group where neither had the equine appeasing pheromone. And then they were separated on 3 consecutive days, first time for 5 minutes, then for 10, and then for 20 minutes. And I say, I'm happy to send you all the results and everything, but the significant decrease in the frequency of restless behaviour for both the groups where the foals were treated. And the treatment effect was apparent after 6 weeks, because that's when they were weaned for real, was at the 6 weeks. And what I really liked, which would make complete sense, and it would have been interesting to have foals that hadn't had any separation done at all, again, just to see the difference at the genuine weaning. But after weaning, the placebo group showed more stress-related behaviours than the ones that had the pheromones, which makes sense because they had a better experience if the data was right. So it's all about getting it right first time. And again, we would love it. We'd love nothing more if people would use the product the first time they're doing things, because that would be the ideal for us, would be to say use it before you've got a problem to get it right. But in reality, we know it's an uphill battle of people only look for something off the shelf when they've got a problem, and they usually want to grab something that is a quick fix. So we spend a lot of time on the phone speaking to people saying, you need to speak to a suitably qualified behaviourist, and this needs to be part of a behavioural modification programme, not just in isolation. Second one was clipping, and they had 41 horses in this that were divided into 2 groups, and they were split depending on their initial reactivity to the clipper sounds. So there was the more reactive group and then the less reactive group. They treated one with equine appeasing pheromone and one as a placebo, and then they confronted them with the sound and sight of clippers on 5 consecutive days, and found a significant decrease in the duration of restless behaviour in horses in the highly reactive group. And I'd say it's one of the things we get most positive feedback about is clippers. from people using it. And then this is, I just really, like this use for it. That Patrick, say in Paget from the Ursia Institute, in France, because the Asian wild horses, the Przewalski horses, are endangered due to hunting that goes on, there's this need now for conservation projects. And there's one of these that's set up in France. And they sort of rear them, they sort of breed them there, but then they need to transport them back over to Mongolia. And as you can imagine, it's quite a long way from France to Mongolia. And it involved putting them on a truck to get them to the airport. They then have one flight, I think it stopped in Minsk, can't say that one. But then that plane is too big to land where they needed in Mongolia, so they have to come off that and go on to the other one and then take off and land again. And the problem, as you can imagine, the stress, because these horses were deliberately kept as wild as possible because they have to survive when they get to the other end. The issue at the end was that they were vulnerable to natural predators because they were so bewildered after this sort of transportation ordeal that they didn't form back into a herd quickly, and they therefore didn't protect themselves. They tried using sedation, but again found that it didn't help if they were sedated when they were being released at the other end. So Patrick, there's some great pictures of him with sort of buckets because they produced the pheromone, they had buckets and sponges, and they sort of got the first few times they went with them and travelled dousing the crates with it. And they did find that it made a difference, so they didn't need to sedate them, and that they then would regroup better at the other end, so were better protected, which I think is a lovely use for it. Not very practical for us selling it, but it's a lovely use that it worked for those horses. It's great. So when to use confidence EQ, travelling and recovery. So it's all the things that the trial work's sort of there for, really. Environmental changes, but anything that's kind of new that potentially might worry the horse. And training events, so again, new exercises, social situations, various healthcare procedures. And then we have had people this year using it with fireworks and finding that can help. The difficulty is, and we'll come on to that, is the length of time that it lasts, and is knowing when there's fireworks, because as much as we'd like to just know they're on the display day when we've got it booked in the calendar, in reality people get them themselves now and they go off all over the place. But if you can control that, and I say a really big use on this would be part of a behavioural modification programme, that using it where you see fit to help as an adjunct. It's a clear odourless gel, and it's applied just inside the nostril. There's a picture in a minute. You use it 30 minutes before any new or stressful activity, and that's before there's alarm pheromones, before the anxiety started to raise. Because going back to the spider, I would have been way more anxious if it had just happened. I'd have sort of dealt with it hopefully dealt with it. But if you'd said to me at some point during when you're up and talking, this spider's going to come up and crawl over here, in fact last night, whenever, the anxiety before I got up to speak would have been ramped up. So it's in the same way of trying to, if you're giving horses any cues, so if you're about to transport them and you're putting on boots beforehand, of course the horse is going to associate that. So it needs to be 30 minutes before you do anything that's predictable and is going to start that anxiety going up. You do need to apply, it's 2.5 hours. Anecdotally, people have talked about finding it lasts longer than that, but that's what the trial work has shown. So we recommend the 2.5 hours, but you can reapply as often as you need to, and use it for the release of the alarm. So that's a little picture there, and you can say this horse did do the phlegm response afterwards. So in summary, I'll just leave this up so you can have a look. Safe and effective. It's a natural concept for reducing stress. So it's all about reassurance rather than calming. You don't tend to find the horses are sedate with it. It's just that certainly with my own little Exmoor, when I was long reining her, I just found that she would still react as normal. It's just that she'd sort of come back to me, the anxiety would come back down to normal more quickly. But she'd still see things. It wasn't that she was oblivious to it. Very much want to put that one in bold, used in combination with behavioural modification. Easy to use, 30 minutes. And I say, makers of adaptable and evaluate. So that's it.